one thing I want to share with you that there was some political commentator in China. They were explaining Sweden as a country because I particularly interested in that because I spent many years in Sweden. So what they were saying is that
Yeah.
Sweden as a neutral country, why it changed its policy, right? If you look at the history of Sweden, it has this profound scare for Russia all these years. So whenever Russia is very powerful and Sweden feels threatened, Sweden will say, "Oh, we're a neutral country. We're a neutral country." And then whenever Russia is weakened, the Sweden will be more like working with the West and insert itself and showing, even though they claim they're still neutral, but they, you know, basically working with NATO, etc., for many years. And now they see their final opportunity. Okay, NATO is, it seems to them that now is the opportunity that Russia is so isolated. So now they officially join NATO. So that, do you agree with that assessment? Because if that's true, I think that's probably explained to me, because I always wondered, 200 years neutrality works so well for Sweden. Why do you change that? But maybe for 200 years, it was never truly a neutral country. It just adjusts its neutrality policy based on Russia. Is that true?
You are absolutely correct. One of the things to say about Sweden and Russia, I don't know how true this is at the personal level in Sweden, but the Swedes and the Russians have never liked each other. There's never been a time that I can remember when the relationship between these two countries has been actually good. During the Second World War, it was fairly well known. And I mean, this is official history. I mean, it's in Britain, it's openly talked about. In Russia, it's openly talked about. I suspect in Sweden it's not, but it's fairly well known that at various stages in the Second World War, until things started to go badly wrong with the Germans, the Swedes were quietly assisting the Germans in the Baltic. That the Swedish Navy was tipping off the Germans about what the Soviet Navy was doing. And of course, they were exporting iron ore and machine tools to Germany throughout that time. So this is something the Russians, by the way, have never completely forgotten. And the Russians, I mean, I've never been to Sweden myself. I don't know Sweden so well, but the Russians believe this goes all the way back to the early 18th century, when Sweden was in control of large areas of what is now Russia on the southern bank, on the southern side of the Baltic. And there was a long war between Sweden and Russia, in which Sweden was eventually completely defeated. And the most important battle, by the way, took place in 1709 in Poltava, which by coincidence is the very same city where this missile strike happened. There was another Swedish-Russian war, by the way, in, I believe, 1810, 1811, when the Russians and the Swedes again fought each other. The Swedes at that time sort of in alliance with Napoleon. This is before Napoleon invaded Russia. And it was over the course of that war that Sweden lost control of Finland, which was transferred to Russia, and for about 100 years became a Russian province.
Yeah. Well, the World War II thing that you talk about, I think even in Sweden they admit that. And now, in terms of their real collaboration, how deep they were working with the Nazi Germany, they don't talk about that. But at least they admit one thing they cannot deny is that the German troops use part of the Sweden territory to get to Norway. I mean, they cannot deny that. They didn't tell the Nazis, no, this is my territory, you cannot come in. The Nazi Germany did go through, Sweden. So that they cannot deny that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, lots of things has its explanation. I was always puzzled. Why do they change this thing that they worked so long for them? But maybe it never was a fully neutral country. I think deep down, like you said, they probably have.
Well, the Russians don't think that it was. And I'll say this, when Sweden chose to join NATO, the Russians accepted it. I mean, they said, look, Sweden has never been our friend. It's always been our enemy. We understand that. The thing that really hurt them was not when Sweden joined NATO, but when Finland did, because after the Second World War, the Soviet Union and Finland became very close. The Soviet Union invested very heavily in Finland. It helped Finland rebuild its economy. The Soviets, the Russians, thought they had a good, stable, friendly relationship with Finland. The Russians, the Soviet army, the Red Army had defeated Finland, which was allied to Germany in the Second World War, and had been on the brink of occupying all of Finland. And it didn't happen because Finland ended the war and promised the Soviet Union that they would remain neutral forever. And the Soviets accepted that promise and developed this long and very deep relationship. And they now feel very angry and very betrayed about it. Finland has made a huge mistake. Sweden, I mean, as I said, the Russians never really took Swedish neutrality especially seriously.
Yeah.
But Finland, they not only saw as neutral, but in a certain sense as friendly. And I don't think they will forget that, and what they see as a betrayal, and forgive it very easily.
Yeah, I also agree that Finland made a huge mistake. I also think that Sweden made a mistake by joining the NATO. They will regret this. And in fact, I think even the polling number at the time, majority of the Swedes didn't want to join NATO. It's the Swedish government pushed for this. Yes. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing is Ukraine is talking about they want to involve 150 countries in a peace summit, and this time they said they want to include Russia. You see, I don't quite get it. You know, you're having so many countries. What's the purpose of so many countries? We do have a saying. You probably have something like that too. You can't have too many chefs in the kitchen, isn't it? I mean, what's the purpose of so many countries?
Well, this is exactly right. I mean, what the Ukrainians are trying to do is they're trying to organize a peace summit in which everybody puts pressure on the Russians to stop the war. This is why we're going back to Brazil and India. This is where this whole situation has arisen, because you can see that the Ukrainians and probably the Americans too have been telling the Brazilians and the Indians, let's all go to this peace summit. Let's have a discussion there. Let Russia come too. And let's tell the Russians, look, this has gone far enough. You've proved what you made your point. Let's have a ceasefire. And after that ceasefire, then we can start talks. I think this is really what the Ukrainians are trying to do, what the Americans and are trying to do. And as you rightly said, the Brazilians and the Indians, who are very keen to appear like, the great mediators, and Lula and Modi want to show that they're the big friends and supporters of everybody, and that they're great international spokesmen. They've been trying to go along with it. And the Russians are telling them, this isn't going to work, because we've been here many times. We've actually agreed in the past ceasefires with the Ukrainians. We did this twice in 2014 and in 2015, and it didn't work. We did it again, by the way, in early 2022. And we thought we'd come to agreements with them. And it turned out that those agreements meant nothing. And in fact, all that the Ukrainians are really trying to do is that they're trying to stop the war because they're losing the war. And then they're going to come back with the same old demands that they always make, that they want us to withdraw from every part of the territory that Ukraine possessed when it became independent in 1991, and only then and only then will they talk about the important issues. And that is clearly unacceptable for us, and we're not going to do it. So that's what the Russians are telling the Brazilians and the Indians, and you can see what the Ukrainians are trying to do. They're trying, in effect, to isolate the Russians. It isn't going to happen.
Yeah, but then my question is, okay, they are trying to get everybody to put pressure on Russia. But what if Russia doesn't show up? I mean, they say this time they want to include Russia, but what if Russia doesn't show up? And I'm not sure how many of those 150 countries would be interested in coming as well. I mean, if it turns out the Russian doesn't even show up, and then not that many countries truly interested in this, isn't that going to be another embarrassment? Kind of like
Well,
the
it
back.
is. Well, it is going to be another embarrassment, and it's going to be another flop. And I think the other thing that people sometimes do need to understand is that in a war, in a conflict, sometimes situations arise where negotiations really aren't the answer. And I think Ukraine is becoming that one. The reason is that it's always that the Russians haven't tried negotiations many times. The problem is Ukraine has never been interested in good faith negotiations. So when that happens, um, the only way war can end is when one side or the other wins. And this is what's going to happen this time.
Yeah, I think the problem with war is that you supposedly you already tried to negotiate, trying to find a solution, not to get into a war, right? Find a solution to a problem. But once the war starts, it's almost always you need a winner to emerge
Yeah.
before it can end. I mean, unfortunately, once the war starts, that's just the way it is, right? I mean, if it
Yeah.
could have been resolved without a war, it could have resolved. But once the
Yeah.
war starts, it's always somebody has to emerge as a winner.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, unfortunately, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.